Imagine for a second that your DNA is a time capsule. Inside that capsule is a coded record of every journey your ancestors took, every border they crossed, and every hardship they overcame. For millions of Polish Americans, that code was always assumed to be a perfect mirror of the people living in Poland today. After all, 100 years isn't that long in the grand scheme of human evolution, right? Well, a group of geneticists and historians just conducted a massive comparative study, looking at the genetic markers of the Polish diaspora in the United States and comparing them side by side with modern residents of Warsaw, Krakow, and the rural villages of the Vistula River Valley. What they found wasn't just a minor variation. They discovered a genetic gap so significant and unprecedented that it is fundamentally changing how we understand heritage, migration, and the way our environment reshapes our very biology. If you have Polish roots, or simply a fascination with how human history is written in our blood, you need to hear this, because the results suggest that the Polish-American population has become a distinct genetic island, preserved in a way that the mainland has not been. To understand why this gap is so massive, we have to go back to the Great Wave of Migration. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 2.5 million people left the Polish lands for the shores of America. Back then, Poland didn't even exist as a formal state on the map. It was partitioned between the German, Austrian, and Russian empires. The people leaving were often from small, isolated villages where families had lived for 500 years without moving more than 10 miles. When they hopped on those steamships in Hamburg or Bremen, they were carrying a very specific, concentrated version of the Polish genome. They arrived in places like Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit, established what we now call Polonia, and largely married within their own communities for several generations. This created a genetic snapshot of 19th-century Poland, frozen in time and transported across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the 20th century was about to unleash a series of events that would act like a massive genetic blender. While the Polish-American community was growing in the relatively stable environment of the American Midwest, the population in Poland was subject to some of the most intense migration and displacement events in human history. We are talking about massive shifts in borders, the forced movement of entire populations from the eastern territories to the newly acquired western lands, and the integration of diverse ethnic groups that had been moving across Central Europe for centuries. By the time scientists started collecting samples for this modern study, the DNA of a person living in Poland today had been influenced by a century of internal churning that the Polish-American DNA had completely missed. When the researchers looked at the autosomal DNA, which tracks all your family lines, they saw the first big surprise. The Polish-American samples showed a much higher frequency of ancient Slavic markers that have actually begun to fade in modern Poland. It is almost as if the diaspora acted as a genetic vault. Because the early immigrants came from very specific regions, particularly the mountainous south and the northern coastal areas, they brought with them rare lineages that were highly localized. In the modern Polish population, those localized markers have been diluted because people from the south moved to the north, and people from the east moved to the west. The unprecedented gap discovered by scientists shows that a Polish American from Chicago might actually have a more archaic genetic profile than someone currently living in the very village their grandfather left in 1900. But the most fascinating part of the study focused on the Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA, the parts that track direct father and mother lines. They found that in Polish-American communities, certain haplogroups associated with the early medieval Polish tribes are remarkably consistent. In modern Poland, however, there is a significant uptick in markers from surrounding regions, particularly Germany, Scandinavia, and the Baltic states. This makes perfect sense when you look at the map, but the scale of the difference was what shocked the researchers. The genetic distance between a third-generation Pole in Pittsburgh and a modern Pole in Poznan is wider than the distance between many separate European nationalities. It is a gap created by a century of isolation on one side and a century of total upheaval on the other. Scientists are calling this the founder effect on steroids. When a small group starts a new population, their genetic quirks become the standard for everyone who follows. But in this case, it wasn't just a small group, it was millions. However, because they settled in concentrated urban clusters, they maintained a level of endogamy, marrying within the group, that was even stricter than what was happening back home. In the American Polonia, being Polish was a core identity that you preserved through your choice of spouse, your church, and your social circles. Back in Poland, identity was tied to the land, which was constantly changing hands. The DNA reflects this, showing that Polish Americans have a remarkably high level of genetic continuity with the ancient Vistula tribes, while modern Poles show a more cosmopolitan, pan-European blend. There is also the factor of environmental epigenetics. This is a relatively new field that looks at how our lifestyle and surroundings can turn certain genes on or off without changing the actual sequence. The study looked at metabolic markers in both groups and found that the gap extends beyond just ancestry. The Polish-American group showed genetic signatures related to the high-protein, high-intensity industrial lifestyle of the early 20th century American city. Our bodies adapt to our surroundings, and over 3 or 4 generations, those adaptations start to leave a mark. The modern Polish population, having transitioned from a largely agricultural society to a modern service economy at a different pace and under different nutritional standards, has a completely different epigenetic profile. The researchers also noted a phenomenon they called genetic drift. When a population is separated by a geographic barrier, like the Atlantic Ocean, they start to accumulate minor mutations and variations that are unique to them. Because the Polish-American community was so large, these variations didn't just disappear, they became fixed in the population. The study identified several unique Polish-American genetic clusters that don't exist anywhere else in the world. They aren't German, they aren't Russian, and they are no longer exactly the same as modern Polish. They are something entirely new. This is what makes the gap so unprecedented. It is the first time we have been able to document the birth of an ethnic genetic subtype in real time over just a century. One of the most emotional aspects of this research for many Polish Americans is the realization that their DNA might be a more accurate representative of their ancestors' world than they ever imagined. When you look at your results on a site like Ancestry or 23andMe, and you see that big orange block of Central and Eastern European DNA, you might think it's just a generic label. But this study shows that for the diaspora, that block is incredibly dense and specific. It is a biological echo of a Poland that doesn't exist on the map anymore. It is the DNA of the peasants, the mountain folk, and the artisans who left before the world changed forever. Critics of the study initially wondered if the gap was simply due to intermarriage with other American ethnic groups like the Irish, Italians, or Germans. To account for this, the scientists filtered the samples to only look at individuals with 4 Polish grandparents. Even within that pure group, the gap remained. The difference wasn't just about mixing with others. It was about the fundamental way the core Polish DNA had evolved differently in 2 different hemispheres. The Polish genetic pool in the US has stayed remarkably stable, while the pool in Poland has been highly dynamic. Think about the implications for genealogy. If you are trying to find a cousin in Poland using a DNA match, you might find that your closest matches are actually other Polish Americans whose families left the same region around the same time. The matches with people actually living in Poland might be more distant because their family lines have been moving and mixing with other lineages for 100 years. This study explains why so many Polish Americans feel a genetic disconnect when they visit the old country. It isn't just a cultural or linguistic difference. Their very cells are vibrating on a slightly different frequency after a century of American life. The researchers also looked at the HLA system, which is part of the immune system and is highly sensitive to local diseases. This provided some of the most striking data for the gap. Polish Americans still carry immune system markers that were useful for resisting the specific blights and illnesses common in 19th century Eastern Europe. Modern Poles have developed new markers in response to the different health challenges of 20th century Europe, including different influenza strains and dietary changes. The immune system is the ultimate record of what our ancestors survived, and the Polish-American immune system is still geared up for a world that has largely passed. This gap also tells us a story about the resilience of the human genome. It shows that we aren't just passive recipients of our parents' DNA. Our heritage is a living thing that reacts to the world. The Polish-American population didn't just stay Polish. They adapted their Polishness to a new continent while keeping the core of their genetic identity locked in a vault. The modern Polish population didn't lose their Polishness. They transformed it through a century of survival in the heart of a changing continent. Both are valid. Both are fascinating. But the distance between them is a scientific marvel. For those interested in the deep history of Europe, this study is a goldmine. It helps identify which genetic markers are truly ancient and which are more recent additions to the Polish landscape. By using the Polish-American community as a control group, scientists can look back in time It's like having a backup drive of the Polish genome from 1890. They can see which lineages were the most successful in the old village structures, and how those lineages fared when transplanted to the urban jungles of North America. Interestingly, the study found that the gap was most pronounced in the Midwest. In cities like Chicago, the concentration of Polish immigrants was so high that they created what geneticists call a population enclave. In these enclaves, the rate of genetic change was significantly slower than in more dispersed populations. If you want to find the most ancient Polish DNA markers, you are more likely to find them in a neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago than in many modern suburbs of Warsaw. This is the paradox of migration. Sometimes the only way to save a culture, or a genome, is to move it thousands of miles away. The study also delved into the genetics of height and physical stature. It's a well-known fact that the grandchildren of immigrants are often significantly taller than their grandparents, usually due to better nutrition. But the researchers found that this wasn't just a simple nutritional jump. There were specific genetic pathways related to growth that were activated in the American environment. The gap isn't just about where your ancestors came from. It's about how their genetic potential was unlocked in a land of relative abundance. The Polish-American genome took the raw materials from the old country and used them to build a different physical phenotype. As we look at these results, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be of a certain descent? Is it a static thing? The study proves that even if you have pure ancestry, you are part of an evolving story. The Polish-American journey is a unique chapter in human history. It's not just about pierogies and polka. It is about a massive genetic experiment where millions of people were transplanted and observed over a century. The unprecedented gap is a badge of honor in a way. It shows that the Polish-American community is not just a branch of the Polish tree, but a whole new forest that has grown from those original seeds. The scientific community is now calling for similar studies on other diaspora groups, like the Italians or the Irish, but they suspect the Polish case will remain the most dramatic. This is because the 20th century history of Poland was so uniquely chaotic compared to Western Europe. The level of population turnover in cities like Wrocław or Szczecin, which were once German and became Polish, created a genetic melting pot that is completely different from the stable growth seen in the American Polonia. The gap is a map of the 20th century's scars and successes. When you look at a map of Poland from 1800, you see a land of many colors and many influences. When you look at a DNA map of a Polish American, you see those same colors preserved with incredible vividness. When you look at a modern DNA map of Poland, you see a beautiful, complex blend where those colors have run together to create a new, modern picture. Neither is better, but the contrast between them is what makes the science so compelling. It proves that migration is one of the most powerful forces in biology. It doesn't just change where you live, it changes who you are. It is also worth mentioning the role of technology in bridging this gap. While the genetic gap is widening, our ability to understand it is also increasing. We can now sequence entire genomes for a few $100s, allowing us to see these patterns with a level of detail that would have been impossible just 10 years ago. This study used thousands of samples, and the sheer volume of data is what allowed the scientists to declare the gap unprecedented. It's not a theory anymore. It is an observable, measurable fact, written in the double helix. If you're someone who has spent hours digging through church records or waiting for your DNA results to update, this study should give you a sense of awe. You are the product of a massive, transcontinental journey. Your DNA has survived partitions, ocean voyages, industrial revolutions, and a century of life in a completely different world. The gap is a testament to that survival. It is the distance between two worlds, and you are the bridge that spans it. The researchers also found that certain traits, like lactose persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, showed different patterns between the groups. In the dairy-heavy diet of America, those with the genetic predisposition for lactose tolerance had a slight edge in health and fertility in the early 20th century. This led to a subtle shift in the population's genetic makeup over 3 generations. It's a tiny change, but when you add up thousands of these tiny changes, you get an unprecedented gap. Our diet literally reshapes our descendants. There is also the question of what happens next. As the Polish-American community becomes more integrated and intermarries more frequently with other groups, that genetic vault is starting to open. The unique signatures of the early immigrants are being mixed with the wider American gene pool. At the same time, Poland is becoming a destination for migrants from all over the world. The genetic gap might never be this clear again. This study was conducted at the Goldilocks moment, late enough to have multiple generations to compare, but early enough that the original signatures were still visible. Think about the stories your grandparents told you about the old country. For many, those stories were filled with nostalgia and a sense of loss, but this genetic data tells a different story. It tells a story of preservation, even if the old house is gone. Even if the family name was changed at Ellis Island, the essence of that ancestry is still there, vibrating in every cell of your body. You are carrying a piece of 1900 Poland with you as you walk through a 21st century American city. That is a powerful thought. The scientists involved in the study were quick to point out that this doesn't mean Polish Americans and modern Poles are different species or anything of the sort. We are all part of the same human family. But the study highlights how quickly we can diversify. It underscores the importance of the environment and the historical events that shape us. It shows that human biology is not static. It is a river, and sometimes that river splits into two, flowing in different directions for a century before we realize how far apart the two branches have gone. For those interested in travel documentary, this study provides a new lens through which to view Poland and the US. When you visit a place like Chicago's Jakowo neighborhood, and then visit a rural village in the Podkarpacie region of Poland, you are witnessing two different outcomes of the same genetic starting point. You are seeing the past and the future of a people, existing at the same time in two different places. It makes the world seem smaller and more connected, even as it highlights our differences. The unprecedented gap discovered by scientists is a reminder that ancestry is not just a list of names on a pedigree chart. It is a dynamic, living force. Your DNA is not just a blueprint of what you are, it is a record of where you have been and what your people have endured. Whether you are in Warsaw or Wisconsin, your genome tells a story of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of heritage. The gap is simply a measure of that incredible journey. When we talk about the Polish heart, we usually mean it metaphorically, but this study shows that even the literal heart and every other organ in the body is influenced by this unique genetic history. The way we process energy, the way we fight off infection, and the way we age are all tied to this divergent path taken a century ago. It is a biological legacy that is only now being fully understood. As the data continues to be analyzed, we will likely find even more surprises. This study is just the beginning. It has opened the door to a new way of looking at diaspora studies. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about heritage and to appreciate the unique path that every population takes. The Polish-American story is a one-of-a-kind genetic odyssey, and the gap discovered by scientists is the map that finally shows us how far we've traveled. So, the next time you hear someone talk about their Polish roots, remember that it's more than just a heritage. It's a genetic reality that has been shaped by the Atlantic Ocean, the industrial heartland of America, and a century of absolute isolation from the biological churning of Europe. The gap is real, it is unprecedented, and it is a beautiful testament to the way our history becomes our biology. Polish-American DNA is a living archive, a survivor of time and distance, and its story is one of the most fascinating tales ever written in the language of the genome. In the end, we are all a collection of stories. Some are written in books, some are told by our elders, but the most enduring ones are the stories written in our DNA. The gap between the Polish-American and the modern Pole isn't a divide. It's a space filled with a century of life, growth, and survival. It is the evidence of two different ways to be Polish in a changing world. It is an amazing discovery that reminds us that while we may look back at our history, our DNA is always moving forward, carrying the past into the future in ways we are only just beginning to comprehend. The gap is not just a scientific finding. It is a biological bridge between two worlds that may be drifting apart genetically, but will always be connected by the same original, unbreakable thread of ancestry. As the scientists concluded their study, they noted that the gap is not a sign of weakness, but of incredible adaptability. It shows that the human genome is prepared for anything: war, migration, total social collapse, or the transition from a peasant village to a modern metropolis. The Polish genome survived it all, in two different ways, and flourished on both sides of the sea. That is the true takeaway. We are built to endure, and the unprecedented gap is just the proof that we have done exactly that. Whether your family stayed or left, they carried the fire of their heritage with them, and that fire still burns in the DNA of every descendant today, no matter where they call home. It's a story of one people, two paths, and a genetic legacy that will continue to evolve as long as there are stories to tell and borders to cross.